in class, I was talking about the debt, and I mentioned that we were at a $14.5 trillion debt, and our GDP, our annual GDP was probably pretty close to $15 trillion. And that the two numbers were getting pretty close to convergence. And then I went to debt clock and noticed that the debt was $15 trillion as opposed to 14.5, which is what I said in class. Now the reason I said it was $14.5 trillion was because we just had this, we had to raise the ceiling on the debt. We just had to move it, and we had to move it in August to over 14.2 trillion. And I think it was the first week of August, there was this big to-do about whether or not we're going to move it, or it might have been end of July, but I think it was the first week of August. And, Congress waited literally to the last minute to actually go ahead and raise the debt ceiling over 14.2 trillion. And the reason in class, in November, I said 14.5 was I just figured, it's probably about 0.3 trillion more. Well, it's not. It's actually 0.85 trillion more. It's $850 billion more than it was in August. And that made me realize, well, August, September, October, November, 4 months, so that number needs to be tripled. Well, 3 times 85, it's basically $2.5 trillion a year if we maintain that rate of spending over a 12-year period. And so the debt clock actually allows you to look into the future a little bit, and it gives you an estimate, and then it also gives you at current rates of spending. At the current rate of spending, if we sustain that, because we're now going into debt at a rate of about $2.5 trillion a year, but that's going to only increase over time. So if it's $2.5 trillion next year, it'll be $2.65 trillion the year after, it'll be $2.8 trillion the year after that. So it'll average to roughly $2.67 trillion per year over the next 3 years, which means we're going to add $8 trillion to the debt by 2015, which is only 3 years away because this is the last month of this year. So basically, we're going to be at $23 trillion in 3 years. Our GDP, our annual GDP now is $15 trillion. It's actually $20 billion less than the debt at the moment. So for the first time in U.S. history, we have a debt that's actually greater than our actual combined annual income. We will be completely insolvent. There's no way that the United States of America by 2020 can sustain a $33 or $35 trillion debt. It's beyond our economic ability. And as it is, this year we've already lost our credit rating. It went from AAA status to AA plus status, and there's already talk of us going to just AA, and that we're going to lose another rate. Belgium this year, just this last week I think, lost its AA plus status and is now AA. France just lost its AAA status and now is AA plus. I mean, we're seeing sort of a trend in the, at least where the United States and Europe is concerned. So we started really debt spending in 1981. Prior to 1981, from 33 to 81, for that 48-year span of time, we were debt spending, but not on the level that we do now. It wasn't the epic kind of debt spending that we're doing now. Up until that point, we had accumulated a $500 billion debt. In today's dollars, that'd be a $1.35 trillion. So today's the debt of 1981 is roughly about 8% what we owe now. So in other words, if we had sustained that level of debt spending, our debt would roughly be 8% our annual GDP. In 1981, we kicked off this massive debt spending event by Ronald Reagan. In his 8 years, he added about $3.5 trillion to our debt. And remember, $3.5 trillion, but if you convert it to today's dollars, you're really talking about probably somewhere around $9 or $10 trillion in today's dollars. He ramped up this debt in the 1980s by doing two things. One, he cut our taxes. Now, I shouldn't say he cut our taxes because he cut a segment of the population's taxes. He did a tax cut in 81, his first year in office, and then he did a second tax cut in 87. In the meantime, he actually did 5 tax increases. Now the 2 tax cuts, the first tax cut was very heavily aimed at the upper class. The second tax cut was aimed at the upper class and the lower class. The 5 tax increases were effectively aimed at the middle class. So what Reagan did over the course of his 8 years was he redistributed the tax burden from the upper class to the middle class. Because even though the lower class had their taxes lowered in 87, their contributions were pretty insignificant because they were so poor. So in effect, what happened was finance in the United States had gone from being very heavily oriented on the upper class to being very heavily oriented towards the middle class. So it was basically a giant tax redistribution. While he's doing that, the natural sort of normal, I'm a mature person, I'm a responsible person response should have been to go back and then cut spending. If you're going to cut taxes, you cut spending. If I have a job that gets me $100,000 a year and I decide I don't want to do it anymore, and I get another job now that gives me $60,000 a year, I have to cut spending, right? I mean, it's just that simple. Not only did we not cut spending in the 1980s, we actually increased spending, and almost all of the increase was towards the military. And this was sold to us as this genius package called Reaganomics, also called trickle-down theory. And if you cut taxes to the rich, it would trickle down to the middle class because it would mean better jobs, more jobs. It's the most ludicrous, nonsensical, only a bunch of really naive, maybe uneducated people could ever possibly believe that would work. In part because one of the reasons the upper class is upper class is they know how not to spend their money. So none of that money is actually going to trickle down because the upper class is going to hoard it. That's why they're upper class. They know how to hoard. It's nothing new. John Locke talks about this in the second treatise on government. He says the upper class's tendency is to hoard. That's why we give them money. Because if we didn't give them money, according to John Locke, they would hoard food and we would start starving to death. But what we've done is we've made a deal with them. We'll give you money, you hoard that, and you give us the food for the money, and then we don't starve to death. So we've known about this hoarding tendency of the upper class for 400 years. This is oh wow, look, none of the money trickled. Also, it's really insulting because I have this image of bodily fluids trickling. So, we get this Reaganomics trickle-down theory. The next 4-year term was done by George Bush Sr. Over the course of that 4 years, he added about $1 trillion. Clinton, over the course of his 8 years, adds another $1 trillion. And then Bush Jr. comes in, and over the course of his first 7 years, he adds somewhere around $3.5 trillion, which means he's spending at right about the same rate Reagan is until you remember inflation. And then what you realize is George Bush Jr. is probably spending about half of what Reagan is in actual, once you counter for inflation in actual dollars. So Jr. isn't as bad as Reagan. I mean, that's the level at which Reagan was a debt spending freak. Which is ironic, of course, because the liberal period, which is 33 to 81, that 48-year span, is always portrayed as this tax and spend era. And the amazing thing is it was an era that did spend. I mean, it believed in Keynesian economics. When times are bad, the government spends. When times are good, you can think about starting to balance your budgets. And as a general rule, that period had pretty gradual economic growth. We started getting in trouble in the 70s. The 50s were great. The 60s were pretty hopping. We started to get into some serious trouble in the 70s. But for two of those three post-war decades, we really were doing very well. And for 3 of Eisenhower's years, Eisenhower did manage to balance the budget. Now, he did that in part by increasing the top tax bracket to 90%. So a conservative Republican president believed that the upper class should pay taxes to balance the budget, and he enforced it. He didn't succeed in getting balanced budgets for more than three years. He only got 3 years, but I mean that was pretty good. Clinton had 2 years of balanced budgets in his last 2 years, 99 and 2000. Going in to 2001, as Junior is becoming president, we are actually sitting on top of surpluses, budget surpluses. Now, that's a little deceptive. And the reason that's deceptive is because the Congress, to balance the budgets, began counting Social Security. When Social Security was created, the idea behind it was, I put money into Social Security, that Social Security money then gets set aside in a bank account that generates interest. When I retire, I then start drawing the Social Security out of the money that was set aside by the government in this bank account. Well, starting in the 70s, and then especially in the 80s and the 90s, Congress realized, oh my God, look at all this money just sitting in bank accounts being wasted when we could be spending it. And it would make us look like we were in less debt. And so they went on this crazy spending spree and slowly got rid of that Social Security debt, or Social Security bank account. Effectively, what happens now is when we get to Social Security revenue, we count it towards our budget when we shouldn't. We should have to say, no, this is being set aside. So the irony is when Rick Perry said Social Security's Ponzi scheme, he was actually correct, because a Ponzi scheme by definition is a scheme where you take a new group of investors and you distribute the money that they're investing as benefits to the old investors. Social Security wasn't set up that way, but it was morphed into that over the course of the last 30 years. It was originally set up not as a Ponzi scheme at all, but as an insurance policy. It has been transformed into a Ponzi scheme by Congress. The problem with that now, and the reason that this is an issue today, is we didn't actually have a surplus in the last 2 years of Clinton's administration. Once you take that out, take that Social Security money out of the equation, we were actually still debt spending. But this ideology of reckless economics that came out of Reaganomics, where we would cut taxes and then increase spending, became kind of a theme in 10 years ago, where conservatives came out and said, it was actually the most ridiculous argument you ever heard. If I owe you $100, but my payment this month is $8 on that $800 debt, and I give you a $10 bill, I should expect $2 and change. But that doesn't make sense. You should really expect no dollars and change, and then now you owe me 90, not 92. Like, you should be, there is no change in this scenario. The irony of the way they framed this was that they actually decided, instead of taking that that surplus, and adding it to the debt and lowering the debt, they actually decided they were going to do tax cuts. So Junior comes into the presidency slashing taxes when there really is no surplus, because we're counting Social Security when we ought not be doing it. To make things worse, the baby boomers didn't have a lot of kids. They had the X generation. Well, the X generation is this, if you look at a demographics map of the United States, it's this little waste, right? And that little thin area now has a serious problem, because as the baby boomers are retiring, we're 1 or 2 years into their retirement, as the baby boomers retire, the X generation is now having to pay for the baby boomers' Social Security. They shouldn't have to pay, because that money should have been set aside by the baby boomers as they were working. But because Congress spent that money, now the X generation is stuck paying for their current Social Security, and the X generation being smaller than the baby boomers means that there's too large of a burden. So we're actually adding more to the debt as a result. Here's the tragedy of this whole story, and it's this. If we decided to fix this, and we apparently don't have the will to do it, because the way we would fix it is raise taxes. And Congress has made it categorically clear that they will not raise taxes. But that's how we have to do this. We have to increase our taxes, and we need to cut spending, especially on unimportant things. Now, unimportant things are like the military. We have a bloated military. We're spending $700 billion a year when we could probably spend $100 billion a year and be just as secure, right? So about 6/7 of what we're spending on the military is just pure crow. We don't need to spend that kind of outrageous money. Just as an example, I think we either have 13 or 14 full-size aircraft carriers. Let's say it's 13. I don't remember the exact number. There are 15 in the whole world, because France has 2. So are Are we protecting ourselves from France? Like, why do we need so many full-size aircraft carriers? We could probably have 6, and we would still be the world's superpower. We could have 7, one for each of the 1st through 7th fleets, you know, and then we would still dominate the seas. Now the Chinese just bought a aircraft carrier from the Russians, but it's more like one of our Marine Corps amphibs than it is one of our full-size aircraft carriers, and I don't even know how many of those we have. So it's not a match, it's not a challenge. The Soviets never had full-size aircraft carriers like the 2 French ones or the 13 or so that we have. So we have this bloated military. Now, people say we should cut entitlement programs, and entitlement programs have come out as a possible thing to cut. The reality is that entitlement programs are a huge drain on our economy. But they're called entitlement programs for a reason. The reason they're called entitlement programs, because people are entitled to them, is because people paid for them. So to cut entitlement programs is to tell somebody, it would be like you go to the store and you buy $1,000 whatchamacallit, and you know that's at the cash register, and then you walk to where you're going to pick it up and then take the thing and put it in your car, and you get there and they go, oh, I'm sorry, we can't give you the $1,000 one, we're going to give you a $600 value one. And you say, wait, I paid for the $1,000 one. And you go, yeah, but from the time that you walked from the cash register to pick up the item, the economy collapsed and now we can't afford to give it to you. It doesn't make any sense. It's morally bankrupt. You can't, we may have to cut them, but it's morally bankrupt to cut them. The things that we can cut are the discretionary funds in the military, because those are the types of things that we probably don't, you know, but some of that's muscle. You don't want to cut too deep into that. You're gonna hurt. For example, the budget proposal that was passed by Congress in 2011 would do things where it would say, I don't remember an exact example, but it would maybe cut $40 billion out of a program. Well, that $40 billion went and actually it created jobs and it generated revenue. And so the $40 billion would be offset then by the lost jobs and the lost tax revenue. And so it wasn't a real cut. It actually was it just caused a lot of pain and grief, because the people who were going to benefit from that $40 billion aren't going to benefit now. But by the time you impact the economy, you've actually lost $40 billion worth of revenue. And so at best, you've broken even. What's the point in doing those types of programs? We need actual meaningful cuts. Let's say we do the meaningful cuts. Let's say we figure out a way to do it, and let's say we figure out a way to raise taxes. We find the will. We go back to Dwight David Eisenhower's 90% on the top tax rate. Let's say we do it. Well, who pays the debt? The X and the Y generation, and the baby boomers will contribute some, because there's still 18 years of baby boomers who haven't retired yet, because we've just started to retire them. But that means that the youngest of the baby boomers will be paying to cut the debt down for the next 18 years. So basically what happened was the silent generation, the generation before the baby boomers, and the baby boomers in the 1980s, the silent generation decided to cut taxes and raise spending. The baby boomers sustained that as they became the new decision makers in the 90s and the aughts. So basically, for 30 years, they've driven up and created this $15 trillion deficit. That's debt that's completely out of control and looks like it's spiraling out of control, to the point where we might be facing in the next 9 years a $33 or so trillion debt. They've created this thing, got all the benefits from it, lived high on life, and now they're retired or dying, or they're retiring. Which means now the X and the Y generation have to come in and pay for the debt that was created by the previous 2 generations who benefited from it. We didn't, and now they're out of it. It's just as immoral, bankrupt, and wrong as if somebody broke into your home, stole your money. It is pure, total, unadulterated, transgenerational theft. If you were a criminal, you couldn't come up with a better scheme to plunder a group of people. They literally, if they had time machines, they couldn't have come to the future and plundered us better than what they did by running up this crazy debt. Because they're the ones who ran it up. They're the ones who benefited from the 15 trillion, and now we have to pay. But at the weakest moment in our economic history, so as our economy is unraveling, it's unraveling in part because of this huge debt burden. as our economy is unraveling, and because we've gotten rid of our industry, and because we don't produce anything, we're a debt-generated society. I mean, everything that we do economically is debt-oriented. The personal debt in the United States is $25 trillion. Altogether, the United States owns $40 trillion at this moment, which is just over $100,000 a person. I think it's like $127,000 a person. So you think of the average, I'm talking to everybody, even the little babies. You know, everybody, on average, owes $127,000 in personal debt and federal government debt. That federal government debt is just as real to you as an individual as that personal debt is. In fact, it may be more detrimental. So what we could do is we could retract some of that debt by trying to pay it off, right? But the problem with that is our economy has become so debt-oriented that it doesn't function unless we generate more debt. So our whole economy has become like this Ponzi scheme. The only way we keep the economy going is by generating more debt. But the more debt we create, the more damage the economy becomes, the less sustainable the economy is. If we started to pay the thing off, the economy would spiral out of control because, for example, we wouldn't do Black Fridays, which is just a big excuse to run up more debt. We would actually have to stop doing that as individuals because the economic cost, long-term, buying a bunch of Chinese goods that aren't worth buying, right, on debt, the long-term consequences is that we're putting the United States back further and further. But if we don't do that, then there aren't the real retail jobs. And because there's no retail jobs, there's no tax revenue, and a bunch of people are unemployed, right? And so we're caught, and we've like painted ourselves into this crazy circle. There's only one thing that can happen out of all this. The U.S. economy is going to have to readjust and learn to live within its means. At the rate we're going, we can let the U.S. economy tank on its own and do an uncontrolled failure, go into bankruptcy, and we should expect the average American now, the median income is probably 50 grand. You know, in 20, 30 years, we should expect it to be around 5 grand if we let it sort of unravel. If we try to fix it, by the time we incur the huge costs of trying to fix the economy, we should expect to be maybe 10 grand a year. It'll be a better long-term consequence, but it means hard decisions now. But it's a little bit more complex than that. In 2008, gas prices spiked, right? In Texas, we got to over $4 a gallon. Now we're just under $3 a gallon. So things are a little bit better. But what people fail to realize is that's also when the economy unraveled. We've been in a depression for 4 years. We went into the depression officially sometime around December of 2007. Now, nobody's calling it a depression because that'll depress you. And the government keeps trying to insist that it was a recession and we're already out of the recession. We're out of the recession for corporations. 2010 was one of the greatest corporate earning years in human history, if not the greatest. The biggest profits ever generated were in 2010. But for the average American, we're definitely not out of this depression. We're actually just as deep in it as we ever were. We might even be worse right now. One of the things that corporations have done is they've slashed their own internal spending by firing a bunch of people. Another thing that's happened is the government has come and bailed out a lot of the corporations, and there's a lot of funds available for corporations. For example, at this moment, Fannie Mae, I think, still owes us $150 billion that we paid them to keep them from collapsing in 2008 when they were unraveling at such a fast pace. So, one of the weird consequences of all of this is artificially low gas prices. Because the economy tanked, demand on oil dropped as well, and so the gas prices are down. If our economy hadn't tanked 4 years ago, we'd probably right now be running $6 or so a gallon, not $3 or so a gallon, which would have the effect of slowing down our economic recovery. In other words, if we did all the things it took to try and correct this debt nightmare, we would then start to see the economy start to pick up again. Demand on gas would start to increase the price of gas, which would pull the economy back down. In other words, we're at a point where no matter what we do, it's going to be painful. The only question is, do we want a catastrophic, uncontrolled collapse, or do we want to have a controlled collapse? 1 week ago, the super committee was supposed to meet to cut $1.3 trillion. They failed to come to an agreement. All economists agree, left and right, all economists agree that we need to cut over the next 10 years a minimum, bare minimum of $4 trillion just to keep us from bankruptcy. So they were supposed to meet and come up with a compromise to cut 1/3 of the bare minimum. They're not even trying to cut the bare minimum. We shouldn't be trying to cut the bare minimum. That just keeps us from collapsing. We need to be cutting so that we can get back on our feet. And they can't even come up with an agreement to cut the bare minimum. Now the tragedy of that is there are these triggers in place that are supposed to cut that 1.3 trillion that they failed to cut. Now the meat of that is going to come out of Medicare to upset the Democrats and come out of military spending to upset the Republicans. Right now as we speak, I guarantee you every possible lobbyist from both sides is in Congress negotiating with Congress, begging them not to allow the triggers to go into effect. So the end result of all of this is that we probably won't cut anything out of the debt. Why? Well, on the Republican side, the rhetoric is we can't raise taxes. On the Democrat side, the rhetoric is we can't cut spending to things like Medicare and Social Security. And so neither side can come to a compromise. At the end of the day, there's a serious moral issue with cutting entitlement programs. In part because some people are relying on things like Social Security to fund their retirement, because the reason Social Security is there is, let's say you've worked for a company for 45 years, it goes bankrupt. You just lost your retirement package. So that $800 or $900 or $1,000 a month that you get from Social Security, you can't live good on that. That's not enough money. That's not what it's there for. It's not there as a retirement package. It's there as an, oh my God, my company's gone. I've lost my retirement package. Now at least I can eat. I can't live well, but at least I won't starve to death. So we really don't want to cut something like Social Security. What we could do is go and find the rich and go, hey, you're not getting it. Bad news. You're just not going to get it because you're making too much money. Thanks for contributing all those years, but we're cutting you out. Well, we certainly don't want to do that with the lower class, and probably don't even want to do that with the middle class. So, I mean, I think that's kind of why we're stuck. I think there's also another factor. You're 60 years old, you're a congressperson, and you know the economy is going to collapse in 5 to 10 years. You're going to get reelected in what? Which you care more about. If you're that old and you're looking at an economic collapse in 5 to 10 years and a re-election in 1 year, the only thing you care about is your re-election in 1 year. And you're going to get a ton of money from corporations to continue the plunder. The plundering that's gone on up to now, the $15 trillion worth of plunder. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars combined are probably $4 trillion of that $15 trillion debt. Well, that was just a massive wealth redistribution scheme. Because all that money, that $4 trillion, went to American contractors. Weapons, defense, they went to guys like Kellogg, Brown and Root, Halliburton. These major corporations have made killer money off of us debt spending. So we've been borrowing from Bank of America, from Wells Fargo, from China, and we've been using that money then to bomb Iraq into the Stone Ages, and then we take that money and we distribute it to these major corporations who then claim the largest ever profits in human history. We would have to do a complete overhaul to our political system, and we would have to do a complete overhaul of our economic system to have the will to dig ourselves out of this nightmare. And the burden is going to be on the X and Y generations. Now, one of the reasons why the X generation, besides the fact that it's made up of a bunch of losers, one of the reasons why the X generation has been so ineffective is not only is it smaller than the Y generation, which is much bigger, and the baby boomers, which is much bigger. So it's kind of sandwiched as the smaller generation in the middle. But it's also because the baby boomers are so good at getting into the positions of authority that the X generation kind of has to wait for the baby boomers to retire or die before they can get into the positions of authority. By that point, the Y generation will be competing with the X generation for those very same jobs. And so it's not up to the X generation at some level. At some level, it's really up to your generation, because you guys are way better situated to do stuff. And the burden is way more on you than it is on ex-generationers like myself, because I'm facing, like, let's say the economy completely unravels in 10 years. So I've got 15 more years of work after that, and then I retire. Whereas for you, if the economy collapses in 10 years, you're 30. You've got 35 years of nightmare, and then you retire. Learn to live in the woods? Yeah, that's not probably a good solution. We have to make a choice here. On the one hand, Americans go, we're a democracy, we're the greatest democracy the world has ever seen. And then on the other hand, Americans go, in frustration, I don't bother voting because there's no point. Well, we gotta pick. Either we're a democracy and we're responsible for all the decisions we make, so which means that the silent generation and the baby boomer generations, the generations that made these decisions, are culpable for running this debt up that's destroying our economy, and we're saddled with it. We either have to say that, or we go, we might as well live in a dictatorship. In either case, the solution might be an Egypt-style revolution, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, at the end of the day, if we live in a dictatorship, why don't we have a revolution? And then you go, or if baby boomers and the silent generation intentionally plundered the X generation and the Y generation, maybe we should have a revolution. What Obama kind of hinted at in 2008. He did an interview with Amy Goodman in August of 2008. I think it was right after the Democratic National Convention. And Amy Goodman asked him, are you going to actually follow through with your promises? And he said, let me tell you a story. And he told the story about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his reluctance to join the civil rights movement, and how Eleanor Roosevelt actually went and got an African-American civil rights leader and brought him to the Oval Office, and the three of them met together, Eleanor, Franklin, and the civil rights leader. And the civil rights leader presents this whole argument about why the president should get involved in the civil rights movement. You know, it's the 1930s, and at the end, the civil rights leader goes, well, Mr. President, are you going to help us? And Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, are you going to make me? And that's how Obama answered Amy Goodman's question. He answered it by effectively saying, are you going to make me? And we didn't. We have not done anything that would give Obama the grassroots foundation to do any kind of reform until Occupy, but we're not there in large enough numbers. If we were hundreds of thousands of people regularly at the Occupy movements, then we could force changes. But because we're at best in some cities, maybe in the thousands sometimes, in some cities, we can be ignored. We can be ignored. We can be pepper sprayed. We can have our hair pulled. We can be beaten. We can be arrested, right? Because we're not large enough in numbers. And as a result, what the American people have literally done is they've given up an opportunity to use this Occupy movement vehicle to transform the United States of America. There was a chance that's essentially gone. There's still, the Occupy movement still has, it's holding on to the edge of the cliff. I mean, unless all of a sudden people took to the streets. Now, having said that, that's how revolutions start. Very often, there's a little flare-up, and then it goes away. And there's a flare-up again, and it goes away. No movement ever starts with a goal. Movements are almost always the spontaneous event that just sort of flares up. Now, Occupy wasn't completely spontaneous. There was planning, there was lead-up, there was build-up, and it was completely based on the Egyptian movement, the Egyptian revolution. Because what the Egyptians did was they went and they occupied Medan Tahrir, and they stuck to that spot, and they wouldn't give it up, day or night. And as the police would come in and try to pull them apart, they would fight them, and they would hold their ground. Well, we've never done that. When the police come to get us out of there, they got us out of there. Whether it was in Zuccotti Park or it was in Oakland. Now, in Oakland's case, the day that the police came in and broke it up, there ended up being something like 18 hours or 17 hours, I think it was 17 hours, of rolling street battles between the Oakland occupiers and the police. But in the end, the police prevailed. even though 17 hours must have been really exhausting. In other words, what the Egyptian people managed to pull off something that the American people can't. That's not to say, I shouldn't say can't, I should say couldn't. Because it's not to say that it can't be done in the future, it just hasn't been done up to this point. The Egyptians they began in a town called Mahala, which is actually on the west side of the Nile River. It's near Giza. It's basically a suburb of Giza, which is basically the sister city for Cairo. It's a heavily industrialized, pretty poor, upper Egyptians are sort of the majority of the population. In 2006, they began to unionize. And from that unionizing movement, they led general strikes, and the general strikes went from Mahala, they spread across Egypt. In 2008, they sometimes are referred to as the food riots, but they were actually general strikes. They were protesting food. Egypt actually had food riots, but that was three decades ago. And then what they did was they built these networks across Egypt in 2008. And on January 1st of 2011, they actually had protests that lasted 3 days. So 2008 can be seen as a flare-up, and then again January 1st for 3 days can be seen as a flare-up. And then on January 25th, they did the real thing and it went 18 days. But even that stopped prematurely because all they did was take out Mubarak, they didn't take out the military. So now we're in day 10, I think. This is 28th, I want to say the second phase of the protest started on November 18, I think. Something like that. And now we're on day 10. We've been going at it, or the Egyptian people have been going at it. Thousands of people in the streets, hundreds of thousands on Friday. And it looks like they're forcing the Egyptian military to back down. Now, they held the elections today. Huge turnout, it looks like, which means that people weren't discouraged from voting, but in the meantime, the military really looks like it's a weak position. So the odds are pretty good that the military is going to turn over power to the civilian government. Now that's possible because the Egyptians are in the streets right now. If they hadn't been in the streets for the last 10 days, the military had been saying it was probably not even going to consider turning over government to civilian rule until 2014. That they were going to have the elections now in November, which by the way is postponed. They were supposed to have them in September, so they postponed them already once. And then they were going to have the presidential elections in June. Well, then they were going to turn over the government to civilian rule 2 years after that. So they were going to basically have a puppet government, and then they were going to continue ruling the country. Well, now as a result of these protests, they might turn over civilian rule to the government to civilian rule right now. They might. They've created a provisional government with the prime minister they appointed, and they've told him, "You're going to go ahead and get this government going as soon as possible." They might turn it over in June of next year. I mean, but it's only because the Egyptians were willing to go back out and fight again. Americans at this point haven't learned that lesson. They don't know that the way you get reforms. Americans are naive, and they think that the way you get reforms is through voting. Voting is one of the most useless activities you can do. If you are voting, and that's all you do politically, you are essentially a completely apolitical human being, at least in the United States. Now, in countries that have proportional representation, voting is a very useful thing because you're automatically going to get, your party's going to get proportional representation. In the United States, with a little bit of gerrymandering, your vote can be rigged so that it's completely useless. And that's exactly how our congressional elections are set up. They're effectively just go through the rhythm. Now, we can determine whether the Demoblicans or the Republicrats are running the House or the Senate at any given moment, but that's pretty useless. At the end of the day, there are differences, but the differences are pretty minute. And you got to remember that in relation to the rest of the world, the United States has two right-wing parties. We have a sort of middle moderate party in the Democrats, and then we have I shouldn't say middle moderate, I should say a moderate conservative party in the Democrats, and then we have a radical conservative party in the Republicans, and we have no middle, and we have no left. And I think that does a lot to cripple the dialogue. There's no real discussion of politics. There's no real discussion of economics. There's no real discussion of policy or foreign policy. We're just we just sort of kind of go along with whatever the Demoblicans or the Republicans are doing at any given moment. And then the press goes along for the ride because the press has discovered that there's no profit to be made in having a real discussion. Unless there's a crazy, major, serious, super overhaul of our economic and political system, there is probably no hope for us. I mean, we are done. Us X and Y generationers have been screwed by our parents, our grandparents, and our great-grandparents, who sold us down the river so that they could make a buck. And the really horrible tragedy is, they probably don't even know it. But they might as well have taken a gun and shot us in the legs. That's sad. I feel so betrayed. Grandpa! Dad! How could you do this to me? Why?
First, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you. Then you win.
I heard them say the revolution won't be televised. Al Jazeera proved them wrong. Twitter has them paralyzed.
But at the end of the day, Occupy is it. If you want to make major reforms or change the United States, and it's the only option you have. Now, having said that, it feels like the Occupy movement is at a crossroads, and it's either going to have to rebirth itself or it's going to just slowly die. No, I love that question. All right, so the tactics of civil disobedience when facing the sheer brutality of a police state it can totally mean a transformation of that state. What we're seeing in Egypt, for example, is exactly that. Egypt it's in a transformation period, the quintessential police state. It had 340,000 police, 330,000 military. It had a police force that was actually larger than its military force. The Egyptian police were drafted. The Egyptian police were armed with automatic assault rifles. They were actually Russian, old Soviet paratrooper assault rifles. There was literally a policeman on every street corner in Egypt. Then there's this whole groupthink. And that groupthink means that once they're given an order, they snap to attention and they go. And they mindlessly go. And they go as part of this unit that they've been trained to think as. Now, you have to remember, U.S. military, it's right around 1 million people. So I just told you that the police force is drafted in Egypt and has assault rifles, and then there's the military. There's very little difference between a police force that's drafted and has assault rifles and a military. Egypt is a quarter the size of the United States, but effectively had 670,000 police force / military as opposed to our military. Now, the Military Commissions Act of 2006 effectively eliminated the Posse Comitatus Act, and as a result, we can now actually deploy soldiers in the United States to be used to enforce civilian law, which for 135 years, I think? No, maybe less than that. 130 years, we believed was unconstitutional. We actually said that you could not use a military force, but we now have blurred that line and we will allow it. In the first 4 days of protests, the Egyptian revolution started January 18, went Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Those first 4 days, there was probably 100,000 people in Medan Tahrir on Tuesday, tens of thousands Wednesday, tens of thousands Thursday, like 1 million that Friday. The 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st, those 4 days, the Egyptian people beat the Egyptian police into submission through rolling battles. Those rolling battles had a very serious consequence. It cost lives. Estimates are that 850 Egyptians died, and thousands were wounded, and thousands were arrested, and some of those people that were arrested are just now getting out of jail. Now, the Egyptians did not attack the police attacked the Egyptian public, but then, towards the end, the Egyptian public began to look for the police, and began seeking them out and beating them up. And finally, that's when Hosni Mubarak realized he couldn't sustain the situation anymore with the police, and that's when he withdrew the police and brought out the army, because the police became a symbol for the Egyptian people to focus their anger on and seek out and attack. And so when he brought out the army, it was because the Egyptian police force was defeated. I mean, these guys came out with tear gas, water cannons. There are scenes where people are praying in the streets, being hit by water cannons. They did everything they could to break that resistance, and the people just stood their ground and refused to give up. Now, part of that was grabbing Maidan Tahrir and never leaving it. They refused to give up Maidan Tahrir. No matter what the police did to them, no matter how hard it got, they kept Maidan Tahrir. As long as they kept that physical location and didn't ever leave it, not for nighttime, not for anything, they were capable of bringing down the Mubarak regime. And now, in this second phase that we've been going through, they are very much capable of forcing the army to give up control. Egypt is a country of 80 million people. When it's a police state that's 10th largest army on earth, that has 750 tanks, and it has jet fighters available to it, can the people really take that thing down? And they did. And so the answer is yes, absolutely. Civil disobedience is enough to bring down a police state, even a nasty authoritarian regime. In the case of Egypt, it's not the most authoritarian or the most nasty regime the world has ever seen, but it is definitely an authoritarian regime. Why would we do martial law in the United States? Let's say Occupy Wall Street had gotten really big. It was in the hundreds of thousands or millions of people, and looked like it was going to be a serious movement that could cause the government to topple. Then I think that's when you would use it. Because there's no other reason to. Because we have the National Guard for emergencies. We don't need the United States Army in the United States for emergencies. We have local police authorities who are equipped with armored personnel carriers. There's no reason necessarily to deploy the military because so much of our police force in the United States has military assets available to it already anywhere. So it seems like it's a little redundant unless you're worried that at some point down the road, the American people are going to wake up and be really angry and demand major changes happen overnight. The Bush administration who created this with the Military Commissions Act, with the last Republican-controlled Congress, their justification was, what if there's a catastrophic act of terrorism and we're forced to create martial law? But what would that look like? I mean, is it a nuclear bomb destroying New York City? I mean, what could possibly be so catastrophic that you would need to declare martial law that's an act of terrorism? It's pretty clear that that's not what that's for. What do I think the ideal world looks like, and what do I think the struggle to create that goal would need to look like? If you were to go back 1 year ago, so it's end of November 2010, and tell me in 1 year Egypt is going to have, right, today Egypt had its first possibly ever more or less free and relatively uncorrupt parliamentary election ever. If you were going to tell me that I was going to be on that day talking about that and that there was no President Hosni Mubarak, I would have probably laughed at you. I mean, I would have said, "Wow, that's so sweet. Thanks for telling me the future," and I would have thought you were probably insane. In fact, I was in Egypt in December and January, this last December and January, and in January sometime, I turned to one of my cousins and I said, "So, how many more years do we have Hosni Mubarak?" And he said, "Well, they figured out a way to end death, and so he's going to be pharaoh forever." And, within weeks he was gone. So all of this is a big surprise. I can't think of a better example for what it would look like. So to miss work, to go to Maidan Tahrir and occupy it, was to miss eating. It meant that you were skipping out on those meals. And if you had kids, it meant not feeding your kids. So the way the Egyptian people did this was people took shifts. When I'm not at work, I'll go occupy. Now, the average Egyptian probably works 10, 12 hours a day. So by taking shifts, maybe you could do 4 hours in between work and going to bed. Or maybe you could do 2 hours. So people were constantly going in and out. And people also supported them. So they actually had people bringing food. This is one of the reasons why Occupy Wall Street and the satellite Occupy movements did this, was they were inspired by Egypt. People brought food to Medan Tahrir and they actually fed each other. And they brought water and they took care of each other. So people would go to work, they would provide the food for the protesters in Medan Tahrir. On top of that, Egypt has always had a garbage problem. Egypt has always had trash in the streets. And it's always been a really big eyesore. The Egyptian people during the revolution began cleaning Egypt up. They weren't just cleaning Medan Tahrir, they were cleaning random, everyday places where people would just throw trash in the street. They'd stop throwing trash in the street because the country was truly theirs. And for the first time in their lives, they went, this is mine, I'm not gonna trash it, I'm not gonna let it be trashed. On top of that, once they defeated the police, there were no police to control the traffic. And so there was this tragic situation of, well, what are you going to do? And what the Egyptian people did was they became traffic police. I think Americans are really confused about this. I think Americans go Gandhi, 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 and they don't understand Gandhi. Ahimsa and Satyagraha are not merely accepting violence being done to you and being passive about it. Gandhi helped liberate India by being extremely aggressive. I mean, he was in the Brits' face. People were put in a place where they could be beaten by the Brits, and there was violence. It's not, you don't initiate the violence. You go put yourself in a location and you basically make the government attack you. But once they do, at some level, all bets are kind of off. And it's okay to defend yourself, and it's okay to have rolling battles. It's not just Americans who are nervous about that. The Iranians had the Green Revolution in 2009. And as soon as people started getting killed and imprisoned and hurt, the Iranians pretty quickly backed off. I mean, it lingered for a few weeks, but once it started to get serious, people pulled back. In the case of Egypt, as people died, it just brought more people. And by the time 850 people were dead, Hosni Mubarak was down. This last round, this last 9 days, 40 people are dead and 2,000 are wounded. I mean, there's a cost to be paid. But when you think about 850 people out of a country of 80 to 85 million people, and you're bringing down this dictator, it's a cost that I bet those 850 people were willing to do and died with a smile on their face. I bet they were the proudest people as they were going, and their families are probably proud of them. I mean, that's something that we don't understand in the United States. What's the most meaningful event we do in our daily lives? We go to work, we watch TV, we go to a shopping mall. Like, what do? We're biding time. We're waiting to die. We don't live to make meaning. We avoid living. We avoid struggle. Those people in Egypt, they're not avoiding struggle. They've made meaning out of it. They've turned it into an art, and we need to copy them. This question of utopias, and if you try to construct a utopia as you construct it, you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to miss things about human nature. There's going to be unseen consequences, externalities that you couldn't predict in the type of behavior. I think maybe my answer is Mill, John Stuart Mill. What he said was create a society with as much liberty as possible so people can try different ways of living and basically turn humanity into a giant experimental laboratory. And eventually you'll start to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And so in a way, I think my solution would be, part of my ideal would be to increase the range of possible behaviors. I definitely think we have to get rid of corporations. There should be no business that exists past the immediate community, and it should be owned by its workers. End of story. There's no reason we need an owning class. There's no reason that we need to have a super wealthy elite. Now, maybe they played a role in the 19th century when they were the innovators and the entrepreneurs, but today everybody's an innovator and everybody's an entrepreneur. There's no reason to have an elite class of entrepreneurs who plunder the country and the world. I definitely think we have to start conserving our limited resources. If we don't create a society that stops consuming for the sake of consumption, then we're going to burn ourselves out at a very fast pace. I heard a number that we're now consuming 1.5 Earths. I don't know how you sustain consuming 1.5 Earths. We can only consume one. we need to back off. To do United States standard of living for all 7 billion people would take something like 6 Earths, which is not very doable since we only have one. And I don't know if you know about the conditions on Mars, but they're not very good. So probably not going to be moving there anytime soon. There's no magnetosphere for one thing, so nothing to protect us from the sun's blasting effects. I do know that a lot of the ideologies that exist right now are wrong. Having said that, there are a lot of ideologies that have really, really awesome insights. And some of those ideologies are, almost 2 centuries old, and they've had a lot of playtime to adjust and modify and experiment and figure out what works and what doesn't work. And I think we need to do a combination of looking at those for the basis for changes for the future, and then innovating and creating new changes.
First, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you. Then you win.
I heard them say the revolution won't be televised. Al Jazeera proved them wrong. Twitter has them paralyzed.